I want to take a look at a few slides that Dr. Newberg has of brain activity, and Dr. Newberg, maybe you can sort of walk me through these. What are we looking at here? Comparison of baseline to the brain on prayer.
Yeah, so this is actually from an earlier study that we did looking at a group of Franciscan nuns who did a kind of prayer called centering prayer, and it's a very powerful kind of prayer practice. And part of the experience that the nun actually has is this sense of oneness with God, a sense of connectedness with God's Spirit. It's a very powerful experience for them. And what we've been doing is looking at activity levels in the brain. These are two kinds of scans called a SPECT scan that looks at changes in blood flow in the brain. And the brain works very nicely in the sense that the more active a particular area of the brain is, the more blood flow it gets. So we can do these different kinds of scans and see which areas are turned on or which areas are turned off. The slide that you were just looking at, what that is showing, the colors represent the levels of activity. So the red areas are more active than the yellow, the blue, and the black. And if you look towards the top of the scan, that's actually a part of the brain. It's the frontal lobe. It's right behind the forehead. And what you can see is that during the prayer state, the nuns had a substantial increase of activity. There's more red activity compared to what you see when they were just at baseline. The other thing that was also interesting is in the language center, where, again, there's another little blob of this red activity that seems to be associated with the prayer practice. And this made a lot of sense because the person was engaged in a very verbal kind of practice. They were saying a prayer. Now, if you go on to the next slide, what we also are showing there is here on this slide, we're also, again, seeing the prayer state compared to the resting state, the baseline state. And in the back part of the brain, in that parietal lobe part of the brain that's involved in our sense of self, we see a substantial decrease during the prayer state. You can see that where the arrow is pointing, it's almost all yellow compared to the reds that you see at rest. So as I mentioned before, what we typically see in these kinds of practices, as the person experiences a sense of oneness and a sense of connectedness with God or with the universe, there is a substantial decrease in activity in this orienting part of the brain that normally helps us to establish our sense of self. So this is something that, for us, becomes very, very helpful for understanding the nature of these kinds of experiences and how they actually affect our brain and how they affect us. And I also want to pick up on one other point that Roland Griffiths had made before, which is that one of the really unique features of all these different kinds of spiritual experiences, some of the drug-induced experiences that he studied, practiced very powerful mystical experiences that people have had that we've looked at, these tend to result in very permanent changes in the way in which the brain works. People change their entire way of life, to change the way they think about things, change the way they look at their jobs, their relationships, and it can really carry with them for months, years, and really for an entire lifetime. So I think this is another next step for us to look at, which is how do these changes occur in the brain so quickly in what is essentially a momentary time period and affect and rewire the brain throughout the rest of the person's life.
Dr. Vollenweider, if obviously a religious person would say that these changes that are going on in the brain when a person is praying are evidence of some kind of communion with a higher power. But if very similar changes are possible as a result of ingesting hallucinogens like psilocybin, what does that tell us to you about the nature of the experience that people are having?
Basically, I believe that this common denominator, either it's induced by praying or it's induced by drug, it's the essence is the experience. It's not the induction means. So we have compared different drugs, ending up in the same pattern of changes in activation and complex brain patterns and complex networks. It didn't depend on what kind of drugs, if the state was more or less similar, which we have measured by different kind of psychometric measurements or neuropsychological techniques. So even if we use sensory overload or sensory deprivation, quite another technique to go into an altered state or hypnosis, partially if the experience is mostly similar, certainly there are different degrees of alterations, but if the structure of the experience, which we try to assess this complex psychological measurements, there's a strong overlap, then it should also be that the brain uses the same tools, the same parts to enable that experience.
Dr. Griffiths.
May I jump in there?
Please.
The area of research that I've been involved in is sometimes referred to as neurotheology, and it looks at the relationship between the brain and our spiritual experiences. And I think the question you asked is a very, very important one, because one of the potential interpretations of taking a drug like psilocybin and having an experience is that it kind of creates it in an artificial way. And I think many of the people who have had the experience, as well as people who are in a more spiritual setting, recognize that while certainly that's one possible interpretation, that it may also be a way of getting the brain into a state that enables us to experience a spiritual realm, a spiritual aspect of the world, of the universe, in a way that our brain normally can't do it. I always use the analogy about me wearing glasses, that when I wake up in the morning, it's a very fuzzy world. I put my glasses on and I see the world clearly. It's possible that these kinds of experiences are not artificial or false, but really enable a person and a person's brain to experience the world in a much more fundamental way. Now, obviously, as we do more research, we might be able to get to a bigger answer to that question about what's the real nature of reality, which to me, all of this research is ultimately getting at. But it's a very complex question to try to figure out what the real nature of these experiences are, what the real reality is. It's far from a simple answer, and hopefully all my colleagues here and around the world, people who are doing this kind of research, will be able to explore this bigger question. It's a neuroscience question. It is a philosophical question. It is a theological question. And this kind of work has very important implications for all of that.